conversations, the first of two sessions between some community leaders and you all, the public. Thank you, the public, for tuning in. This is a collaboration between Miami University Regionals and the YWCA of Hamilton. It started as a conversation between just a few people and expanded to this. So without further ado, Miami University Regionals, the YWCA of Hamilton, would like to thank you all again for tuning in, and we'll go ahead and get started. I am going to be the moderator for today. I am Dr. Boyce Hamilton, the Director of Diversity and Multicultural Services for Miami University Regionals. I am a firm believer that the Office of Diversity at Miami University Regionals is a hub for critical dialogue, for providing students with space, students, faculty, and staff for spaces where they can converse about any and everything without feeling like they're in the wrong place. So with that said, we will get started with our program. I will introduce our panelists to you. First, I would like to introduce, and I will just give you their name, what their background is, and their place of employment. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Helane Androne, who's the chair of the Department of Interdisciplinary and Communication Studies for Miami University Regionals. Next, I would like to introduce Wendy Waters-Connell, who's the CEO and Executive Director of the YWCA of Hamilton. And then we have Craig Bucheit, who is the Chief of Police for the City of Hamilton. And one thing I have to tell you all is Chief Bucheit is interrupting his vacation with his family because he thought this was necessary and important enough to be here. So Chief Bucheit might not be with us the whole time, but Chief, we thank you as well as the other panelists for being here and taking your time out. Our next panelist is Boyce Swift, the Director of Human Resources and Talent Management for the YMCA of Hamilton. And finally, we have Samy Broyles, the Executive Director of the Booker T. Washington Community Center and also a member of the YMCA of Hamilton. So panelists, welcome. With that said, just tell you a little bit about how things are going to go. I will ask you each a question individually, and I would like for you to answer that. And if anyone else on the panel would like to chime in after that and answer the question or fill in the blanks, please feel free to do so. And that's just kind of how we'll get started. So my first question will be to you, Chief Bucheit. Again, thank you for being a part of this. What is being done between the citizens and police officers to maintain and in some cases regain a sense of trust between both groups?
Thank you, Hamilton. What I would say to that point is I became chief in 2015 in January, and there were a couple things that we set out to do, and I think we have worked very hard over the past 5.5 years to accomplish. The first of those was providing for safety and security for the community. That's critical for police. It's really the bread and butter of what we do is make sure that people are safe, to make sure they're secure, but in conjunction with that, I talk about being two sides of the same coin. Safety and security being one side, the other side is trust and confidence, and building and strengthening relationships in the community, establishing trust and confidence. That those two things go hand in hand, and so we have worked extremely diligently over these 5.5 years to build that trust and confidence. Some of the things that we do, it's just being in the community, being out with our neighbors at community events, being in the schools and at the schools. So even before we had a school resource officer program, which I want to thank Hamilton City Schools for working with us and getting 7 full-time Hamilton police officers in our schools every day. And that, really cannot, you can't stress enough how much that helps us build relationships with young people. So we were in the schools, stopping by, doing school checks long before the SRO program came online. Now we have 7 full-time SROs. Stopping by the events in the summertime, what we started was we call our summer resource officer program. So we have a couple of officers that are able to go out in the community since school's not in session to, stop by, whether it be BTW, Boys and Girls Club, East Avenue, Grand Boulevard, but be in our parks, be at the splash parks, be out in the community, be interacting with young people in our community. We have our open house that we run every year. It's a great opportunity for the community to come out. We open our doors and literally welcome the community in to to have a conversation, to see how we do things. We have several tours and several PowerPoints and demonstrations, opportunities for people to see how we work. Our Citizens Police Academy has become just a great event for the community to come out and spend 6 weeks with us on a designated night every week, and touching on different parts of what we do every day. Our community safety programs, so whether that be women's self-defense, active threat training, security assessments at schools or private businesses, nonprofits. So we'll go out and talk to employers, locations, businesses, and employees about what they can do for their own personal safety, for their own safety in their businesses. There's a whole host of things that we do, partnering with the 17 Strong, neighborhood commitment, being at neighborhood meetings all across the city. It's just an everyday commitment. It's a philosophy and it's a commitment that we preach and we practice every day. And that's go out there and build and strengthen relationships in our community on a continuing basis.
Thank you for that. I know that as part of the community myself, I've participated in many of the events, and I think that the more that there's a police presence, the more that aids to the safety and security and the feeling of well-being and trust between the citizens and the police. So thank you for that. So my next question is to Samy. What advice can you give to persons in the community who want to address a lack of visible support and collective efforts from their places of work or churches or schools without experiencing a backlash? Where do people begin?
I would advise someone in that situation to begin by talking to the leader, just have an open conversation, giving them a chance to react first before just making the assumption. And sometimes we assume things before we actually have the conversation, and have it in a way that it's not from a way of anger but have it from a way of understanding. So trying to have somebody have the ability to understand. And then if you cannot get traction with your leadership, I would then go to my coworkers and try to have those kind of same conversations with people that you feel that you have a good relationship with, you can trust. And if that cannot happen there, my third option would then, there's going to be like-minded people outside your organization. If you can't figure it out internally, externally, find people and then use those relationships to help drive that home. And actually, we're all protected on some level through the EEOC if someone is going to give you backlash. And then I would say definitely take that direction if you do get backlash for actually speaking your opinion on something that is very passionate to you and your community that's affecting people.
Thank you, Samy. I know that you and I have collaborated on a number of projects, so it's all about those external partnerships as well sometimes. Excuse me. So my next question is for Wendy. There's been a wave going across the country, Denver, Indianapolis, Columbus, and Dayton. And the wave is about actions that people can take to declare racism as a public health crisis. What are your thoughts around the topic?
Thank you for asking the question, Benice. YWCAs across Ohio have been working to have racism named as a public health crisis for the last year. Cleveland was really the leader in our state and the first major city to endorse a declaration. The YWCAs believe that this needs to happen because it goes to the root of what happens across all sectors. Racism impacts things like infant mortality, and in Butler County, Black and brown babies die at twice the rate of white babies. And we believe this has to do with access to healthcare, transportation, social determinants of health, adverse childhood experiences, as well as a lack of appreciation for what Black and brown women go through in pregnancy. We've already seen some of the impacts of racism when there are stereotypes applied to individuals in dangerous situations. And while the Hamilton Police Department here, we are very fortunate. They embrace certainly the YWCA with a guardian mentality, and they're here within seconds when we call them, when a perpetrator is about to breach our domestic violence shelter. We understand that that may not be true for all police departments. And so naming racism as a public health crisis, understanding that racism results in lower lifespans for Black, Indigenous, and people of color throughout the United States is a way to systematically examine what are the structures that have to be dismantled in order to ensure equal access to care and services and a healthy lifespan for all people.
Thank you, Wendy. I know that a number of articles have come across my desk in doing diversity work about that specific topic. And it's one that definitely needs to be looked into, not only for Hamilton, Middletown, but the entire state of Ohio. So thank you so much for being a part of that. So my next question is for Dr. Androne. It is this, is it the responsibility of departments of diversity and inclusion to address issues of race and injustice for an organization on their own platform, or should there be consistent messages coming from presidents, provosts, deans, chairs, department heads, and if so, well, department heads, just as with any other epidemic affecting their constituents? Forgive me.
Oh, that's fine. Thanks for that question. So I'm going to start by saying I think that it's an act of love to kind of intervene in situations that potentially cause harm, right? It's an act of love for both the people for whom the situation will cause harm, and it's also an act of love to come between, you know, the possibility of people who, deserving or not, would get harm from the situation. And so when I'm asked about whose responsibility that is, I sort of feel like it's obviously all of our responsibility, particularly if we have any investment in our communities. We can't use the terminology community if we're not really interested in all the people in that community. So if there's one segment of the community, any segment, who is suffering, right, who is experiencing harm, then it's all of our responsibility to respond to that, to actually provide opportunities to respond to that, to speak to it directly, because I don't think that we can do much if we're just sort of making kind of benign statements about, you know, what's happening, or trying to gain everyone's approval about what we're saying, but to actually acknowledge, to hear and acknowledge that there's harm, right? Which I think is why this moment is really important. I think it's also important, and I'm just going to grab one of my favorite quotes out from this one, from Martin Luther King Jr. And it's, you know, he said, in the end, we'll remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. And that's powerful because we get a lot of negativity in many, many ways. You know, people talk about the overt, the implicit biases, the explicit biases, all of that. But it's really important to remember that our expectation is that our community is going to be with us, right? That our community will see harm and is not going to leave any segment of that community to fend for themselves. So in that regard, particularly at Miami, when we have love and honor as our sort of mantra, it's really important to do those acts of love, right? Those acts of love mean, you know, having the courage to speak to the harm, right? To acknowledge the harm, to provide opportunities to say, we're going to now do something about the harm. You know, so because our community needs it. If we value peace, if we value compassion, we have to speak about harm to any segment of our community. And so that's why this is, you know, a beginning stage of that, if that makes sense. So.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Because I know that one of the things at the regionals we are very intentional about is also letting everybody that's a part of the community know that they are inclusive of the diversity that we say we value. So thank you so much. So I'm going to ask Boyce a question, and then Chief Bucheit, I'll come back to you, please. Boyce, your question is, what are some specific concrete actions that a member of a community can do to increase inclusivity that will make a tangible difference?
Benice, thank you so much for the question. And again, I just want to start by thanking you so much, you and Miami University, for working so hard and fast to put this together. I'm honored to be at the table. And thank you so much, Wendy and the YWCA, for supporting this as well. And to answer your question, I believe, you know, a member of the community that is interested in taking some tangible steps, I believe the first step is definitely educating yourself and making yourself aware of the issues. I mean, there's a narrative that the news and that social media will play out, but I think that, you know, the best way to start the foundations for some tangible change is to educate yourself, read books. You know, we are in the information age, so it's very easy to use Google or the library. There's so many resources. There's abundance of resources out there to educate yourself on the issues. And then I think that another step is to be intentional about relationships that you have. I think a lot of the issues that we're seeing today are grounded in some feelings or untruths about specific populations or specific groups of people. And I think that, you know, when we expose ourselves to people who are not like us, you know, we learn, you know, different perspectives. We hear different stories, and it helps to change the narrative. It helps us to learn more about the differences that folks have. And so I think that, you know, doing things like this, having discussions, building awareness, educating yourself, voting, and, you know, being very educated in who you're voting on, or doing your research, looking at, you know, what is this individual's stance on certain policies, and certain, I guess, procedures that are going on. And also, I think if you're feeling like there is a gap or there's something missing in your community, you know, being bold and taking the stand, you know, even if you don't know the way, you know, taking a stand and starting an organization or starting a movement of your own, and partnering with, you know, those who feel the same way as you to do that.
Thank you, Boyce. I love it. So often we create our own narratives, and sometimes our narratives are based on untruths. So it's, as you said, it's important to educate ourselves and to find out, or to go to those people and have those conversations. And Chief, I have another question for you. This one, and there's a lot of talk out there across the country about defunding police departments. First of all, can you tell us what that means? Secondly, can you tell us what that would mean for our local department, and how would that make police departments more accountable? So 3 parts.
Funding actually is, because, sorry, I thought I was muted there for a second, but it's hard for me to define what defunded means, because, quite frankly, I don't know. I've seen some of the headlines, I've seen some of the news that's come out lately, and I've read some of the stories. And I think there's a variety of definitions or ideas that are behind that. Frankly, in my opinion, the police are a necessary function of a civil society. It is part of our community. It's part of, the police are the community. And that's one of the things I think that was important to me, being in Hamilton and being the chief, was that this is not about the community and the police, and those being two separate and sometimes two separate groups, and that are sometimes at odds, as much as the police are the community and the community are the police, and that is, we're on the same page, and we are working from the same place, and that is to create a safe, secure place, community for all of us. So to defund, or just I don't understand the concept, and so, but if the goal of that is accountability, that I think is very important. I think transparency and accountability are cornerstones of effective policing in today's world, and I think our organization, and one of the things that I said a couple of weeks ago, after the video had surfaced, George Floyd in Minneapolis, and one of the things that I said was, it's disturbing and it's ugly, and just that video to me was, it was so many things, but just indecent inhumanity, and but I don't have control over an organization or individuals 800 miles, 1,000 miles, or on the other side of the country. So my ability to change a community that I know nothing about, and I'm not part of, is something that I'm just focused here in my community and what we are doing. And so defunding the Hamilton Police Department, I think, would be I think it would be wrong. I think it would harm the community. I think it would endanger our community. So, but holding us accountable and us being transparent, I think is important, and I think it's something that we do, and I think it's something we're effective at.
And Bernice, could I jump in? So I want to just start by just sharing how much I respect Chief Bucheit and his leadership of the Hamilton Police Department. He is such a strong supporter of diversity and inclusion, and it's very visible in the hirings in the police department and a lot of the activities and things that the Hamilton Police Department does in the community. Previous member of the Diversity and Inclusion Commission, I got to work alongside of Chief Bucheit and trying to develop some strategies and ways to break down barriers to diversity and inclusion in the community. So I just commend him and his leadership of the Hamilton Police Department. I mean, if there was an easy way to combat a lot of these societal issues, I'm sure that we would do that in a heartbeat. But I just think that the steps that Chief Bucheit has taken in his leadership of the police department is helping to move in the right direction. But I wanted to say, the defunding of police departments, it's almost like trying to, treat a symptom to find the cure of an issue. And I feel like it would, this may not be a popular opinion, but I'm thinking, more funding of a police department in the terms of, training and different opportunities to bridge the gap between communities, because it's just as Chief Bucheit said, and there's a lot of separation or trying to be divisive in the fact that, it's, this group of people against the police. But like Chief Bucheit said, the police are the community. They're members of the community. They're people just like, everyone. They come in all shapes and colors. And so I think we should we should treat them as such and try to work with police departments. And I think defunding would just be negative, to progress, honestly. So just wanted to share that.
I wanted to jump in on a couple things here, because I think, thank you for all that you all have said. I think it's important to have this conversation because like Chief Bucheit said, there's a lot of headlines, right? There are a lot of headlines, and there are ways in which, these really radical phrases take on multiple meanings, right? And we can't pin those meanings down. So the real question that I think he asked was about what it means, right? Because it's difficult when you hear that phrase, defunding the police. I mean, the initial thought might be, well, that's ridiculous because we don't have a civil society, as you said, without, that there is a role, that an important role that police are playing in our communities. But I think this is where it gets complicated with how those phrases are being sort of thrown across headlines and given to us to respond to and be inflamed by, right? I think that the question that folks who are using that phrase are trying to ask actually is also a question about the level of responsibility that we are laying on the police. And let me say this, because most of the activists that I've spoken to are not saying that defund the police and take police away. You know what I mean? When they're using that terminology, which again has become kind of this radical flag, but what they're suggesting is, how much are we asking police to do? And how much are we actually training police to do those things? The police officers who I know in Cincinnati, they're not necessarily getting the training of a social worker, of a mental health expert, of a, domestic, dispute counselor. We are asking police to do all the things. And I think that what they're trying to say with defunding is to examine what we are asking them to do in relationship to what we really see that we need. Because the question they're asking is a police officer needing to be the first responder, for the homeless population, right? Or is that the role of a social worker who's been trained in a certain way, right, to do certain things? So the things that they're asking, I think, are being sort of taken, and again, sort of the media sort of jumping on this phrase of defund the police. Oh my God, that's radical. But I think that what they're really asking in conversations is, what are we asking them to do, and how do we expect them to be accountable for all of those things and to respond in all of those ways when even Chief Bucheit just said, their objective is about safety, security, and when we want them to come, it is in those situations where there is the potential for violence, right? There's the potential for something that requires an armed response. But we're asking them to respond to things that are not necessarily about armed response. And my second point would be that it is so different. Like, I remember you said also, Chief, that there, the experience in Hamilton, right, is like completely different perhaps than the experiences in other places. And like he said, he can't speak to the relationship of the police, in these other communities. Do they live in their communities the way that he does? Do they, walk and talk with people in these businesses the way they do? I'm a transplant from California, and that's not the case in so many communities. It's not the case, where it sort of does feel like there are folks who are external, who don't know these kids, right? Who don't know these business owners, who, like, when you call them, it is like calling a force from outside to come in and determine who's right and who's wrong in a situation instantaneously, right? And so without even sometimes the broader context. So there, I think there's two things that we need to kind of maybe unpack when we're talking about like how to answer and how to respond to those kinds of phrases. It's like, it's a really radical phrase that hasn't been unpacked, or has, you know, you can't, and to understand that all of these contexts are going to require different responses. Because I know that in some communities where I'm from, when they instituted police actually requiring, like in parts of California where they required police to live in the spaces they policed, the crime rates went down. Why? Because they could say to that kid, I know your mom. You know what I mean? You know you're not supposed to be hanging out right here. Or I know, you know, or how's your grandma doing? I know that this is a different kind of policing than happens in, you know, a lot of different towns and cities. And so I think that it's important to recognize context and to kind of unpack those phrases and to think about what does it mean when you're calling in a force and asking them to be the social worker, the peacemaker, the, you know, the mental health expert, to recognize addiction, to do like all the things, you know. So that's, I think, an important part of this, not to go on and on, but.
Denise, I'd just like to take a moment and thank Boyce and Dr. Androne for those comments. And it is, you know, our officers have over the years been asked to do more and more in terms of social issues, dealing with homelessness, opioid addiction, gang violence, and a lot of very complicated, difficult social issues. And it's overwhelming at times. You know, what we ask of them, you know, to go out and under very trying and difficult and evolving events and make decisions. I think our officers on a daily basis, I think they do, and I think they do it exceptionally well. That's not to say that we're perfect, that we never have or never will make mistakes, but it's about, you know, seeing what's happening in other places across the country, taking those events and learning from those and bringing those back to make to learn from and to build upon. That's important for us, but it is difficult, and I think that's a great point about the defunding piece and how you know, how we move forward and how we define that. You know, one of the things that we talked about when I became chief was recognizing that we had been defunded essentially because we had 120 plus officers, and we had those numbers had been slowly whittled away down to less than 100 officers. And for a community our size, with the issues that we face, those numbers were just not acceptable, and it's just not a point where we can be effective and we can go out there and do that job. So we knew we were going to need to rebuild our police force, and also we were facing a lot of retirements. Unfortunately, you know, getting people into this profession is very difficult right now. So when I entered this profession, you know, almost 25 years ago, there were 500-600 people who showed up based on a small classified ad that ran in the Journal News. We went to the Garfield Junior High School, and they had to give 2 sessions of the test, one in the morning and one in the afternoon, because there were so many people who showed up. Right now, we're making hiring decisions, and we're working off a list of 22 candidates. So to go from hundreds to less than 2 dozen, it's been it's an incredible change and challenge for us. The good news is there are still really great people out there. And so when we faced that 5.5 years ago, knowing we were going to have to rebuild, we're going to have to replace officers, I wanted to go into that and be purposeful and have a well thought out approach. And so that's where we developed this philosophy that we were going to approach this challenge and opportunity. We were going to approach it with this philosophy, and that was that we were going to recruit for diversity, we're going to hire for character, we're going to train for excellence. And I think that has served us incredibly well. And so when you look at the 55 officers that we've hired over the past 5.5 years, I know the Journal News ran a story and they focused on the diversity piece, and that's important. But everybody, especially in situations like this, they want to focus on the diversity that you can see. They want to focus on race and gender and ethnicity. And I think our numbers speak for themselves. I think when you look at where we were 5.5 years ago with 4% African Americans, 3% female officers, and the fact that of the 55 folks that we've hired since then, those numbers in terms of gender are up at 20%. In terms of race are at 11%. I think our efforts to go out and recruit, not hire for diversity, but recruit for diversity, to go out to cast a broad net, to bring a diverse group of folks to the table and then allow the process to work. And that process is getting down to who are the very best people, who are going to go out there and serve our community with passion, with respect, who are going to treat people with dignity. Those are the folks that we want out there, going to work and representing us and our community every day. And I think we've done great. And that diversity piece, that extends beyond the diversity that you see. It's the diversity of background, of life experience, of so many other factors. One of the things nobody talks about is 18% of those folks that we hired have had prior military service. The fact that we took away the minimum age or the maximum age requirement. So just a few short years ago, if you were 35 years old, you were disqualified from being hired as a Hamilton police officer. You weren't even able to be considered. And so the idea that we're hiring people who may be on a second career, but they bring to the table such a rich background of life experience, prior training, and a great deal of diversity that goes beyond what you see. And then the final piece of that is training for excellence, making sure that our officers start out with the very best in terms of training and development in order to give them a great start in their career, and then continually developing our people and working to perfect what they do on a daily basis. Our profession, the things that we face are continually changing, and our training and our professional development has to keep pace with that. That has been a cornerstone of the Hamilton Police Department, and I think that's one of the things that separates us from so many other organizations is the focus that we put on training. Every year that I've been chief, our training time, the hours per officer, has well exceeded 80 hours on average. That's, when you think about what the state of Ohio requires, that level's been anywhere from 7 hours to 11 hours. At one point, it was up to 40 hours. And we were still more than doubling that on a per officer basis. I think that separates us, and I think it makes a big difference in the end.
Thank you. I think that, and thank you for all of your input. But I think that's a wonderful slogan for all of us, Chief. Recruit for diversity, hire for character, and train for excellence. There are so many of us who can carry that back into our workplaces and have that be our mantra as we move forward as well. So I'm going to shift gears just a little bit, and this question will be open for all of our panelists. And it's, while this moment is historic, and it will impact all of us differently. For some, it'll be profoundly life-changing, while others, barely a blip on the radar. What would you like future generations to remember about you and your impact on your community at this pivotal moment?
I would start off, and thanks, Dr. Benice, for asking that question. everything I do today is really thinking about the generation in the future, because I have kids, and I know one day, hopefully, I'll be blessed to be a grandfather, and I want to leave a place for them that's better at each generation. So my kids for them, and hopefully my kids makes it better for their grandkids one day. And as we think about this moment, I really hope that me personally, I'm remembered as someone who did everything I could to try to make a difference, not just on the protest type of level, but actually on a more of a legislative type of level, as far as pushing policies that will address systematic issues that will affect my kids and their kids eventually down the line. So I hope that we in this era can really make some changes that will address systematic issues that is passed through legislature and either through voting, and just showing that we are no longer just going to vote for a party line, but really voting for policies and what the heart of people and actually the actions they are taking to address these issues. And that's what I would love to be remembered for.
Denise, I'll jump in. I have a song that I've been listening to recently from Hamilton, Lin-Manuel's After release, which is Rise Up, Wise Up, Eyes Up. And there's a line right at the beginning that says, I have planted seeds in a garden I will never see. Someday they'll become tall trees. This conversation is a seed. What we do from here, hopefully, will become a tall tree. We have to be willing to talk about uncomfortable spaces and uncomfortable experiences. And more importantly, we have to be willing to listen and absorb what it means in terms of material impacts on communities of color. This is to say nothing of the COVID impact on communities of color. And I know my lens is nurse focused because that is my training. So I apologize to all of you who are listening and to my panelists for having that lens. But I don't think that there can be enough emphasis stated that this is about life and death. And while it is material because of George Floyd's horrendous murder and the decimation of communities of color compared to those who are white under COVID, it's just highlighting what's always been here. So these seeds have got to be nurtured by leaders like yourselves, those who are participating and listening to this conversation by getting involved and taking action. And I thank you for the chance to be here.
Well, I'm happy to jump in. Did I unmute myself? Okay. All right. So, I've had a lot of conversations over the last couple of weeks. And, frankly, I've moved from moments of complete exhaustion to utter rage, right? Like just moving through all of those moments and emotions. And I think, I'm a mother of two sons, and I've had to have this conversation with them many times before. This is not a new conversation that we've had, but I think that I need them to remember kind of the core values of what we're after, right? And God help me if I say learning objective, but but let me just say, like, to remember that the goal is to have, from my perspective, the goal is to have a beloved community, right? The goal is to have a community that builds upon its history and knowledge, doesn't turn away from it, right? Doesn't pretend like it's not there. I want them to remember that this is what we're doing, that every time this cycle comes around, we work through those feelings again, and we try to say, what are we now needing to do? because the cycle keeps coming back around. I think part of the question is like, you know, we all deal differently, etc. But in every situation, you're building on, you know, the expectations and the experiences of the past. And I want them to know that their moment is the same and different than mine. And whatever remains, you know, those same threads that remain that are the same, you have to interrogate those and unpack those, because whatever does not result in integrity and love and compassion, and it ends up in violence and anger and racism and, you know, bigotry, these kinds of things, then those are the lanes, and you don't get to step outside of them. You know, you don't have that privilege to not think about it or to not consider it. And so, I mean, I want them to remember all of those conversations, and the people who've called me from across the country trying to figure out their responses to people's awakenings, right? Because that's part of the exhaustion, you know, the utter absence of ambiguity of George Floyd's death has drawn people into this conversation who might have been on the fence, might have been quiet about it, maybe didn't understand how their feelings were, but they've come into the conversation, and it creates another cycle where we're sort of like, now let's talk about what do we do? How did we get to the place where it was so bombastic, right? Like, how did we get to the place where there wasn't even the concern that he was being filmed? Like, how do we get here? And I want my kids to understand that, and I want my friends and family members of various backgrounds to be able to say, what did we learn from this moment? We learned that if we don't all say something, we will be back here. We'll be right back here. If we don't all take up our own, you know, weight of this, our own cross of this, and sort of start carrying this around and saying, this is not okay. And whatever the walk is that we got here for, we have to rethink that. So that's part of what I think I want them to remember, you know, because we can't, they're not hidden from it. I think I've told Benice, my oldest son grew 5 inches taller in the last 6 months. It's like we went into pandemic and the boys shot up, and I'm, you know, and you know, to have that conversation, like, you cannot do certain things, you cannot wear certain things. Like, having that conversation with a 13-year-old is heartbreaking, but I've had that conversation with him for years. But it's different now, because the point at which you change from cute to scary is real for him. So I want him to understand the kinds of conversations that we're having. I don't want you to have with your kids. I don't want it to matter, you know, what you're wearing or how tall you look, or, you know, what size your shoes, you know, how menacing you might seem. I want you to work so that you understand what we did, and so that you can move this thing forward and make sure it's not the same conversation 5 years from now, right?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in, and Dr. Androne, I love your comments. That was amazing. And I'm about 6 days into this fatherhood thing, and I have a little baby boy, and so I wrestle with this, you know, raising a son in today's society, and the affirmations, the conversations, you know, the hidden rules maybe that I may have to share with him on, you got to be careful about this, or when you're engaging, when you're out in public, you may want to, do these type of things. But I just think that, I want to prepare the next generation for, the reality of the matter, but also be a positive influence. So, I pray every day that I'm able to be an influence in whatever spheres that I'm able to influence. So working within my spheres of influence. So I may not be able to make broad international or national change, but if I can, by being an example, influence one or two or three, I pray that that impact, will go beyond me and spread, and that, through having these type of discussions or creating the space for folks to have honest, respectful, open dialogue about these type of issues, and not just leave it there, but then to take some sort of tangible action towards breaking down some of these barriers that are in society. I pray that doing things like that, and people being able to see that, exposure is everything. So like if people can see that, they can then, take that and know, a positive way to go about handling these type of situations.
Thank you for your comment, and it kind of leads right into the next question, which is, how do we help our youth build a rapport with community leaders when those community leaders have already ruled them as defiant, unknowing, unruly, and so many other negative words? And I'm not saying that's across the board, but how do we then go back into those same communities, work with youth, and expect them to work with us as the alleged knowing and et cetera, adults?
Denise, I'll take a stab at that. And I'd just like to tie the answer to this question back to the last. And Boyce, congratulations. Great to hear that good news. And I think we all have an obligation to this next generation. And Denise, to talk about the young people in our community. We would talk about everybody. I think we all want something better. We all want to leave our community, our world, a better place. But what we struggle with is, what exactly am I going to do to accomplish that? What tangible action am I going to take? And sometimes that's difficult. And I will say the one thing that I try to focus on, that we at the Hamilton Police Department try to focus on, is building relationships. I can't emphasize enough how important it is just to get out and to meet and to engage and to just be part of the community, get to know somebody, get on a board, work on an event, roll up your sleeves, and go to a community meeting, and just be there, be present. So the last question was, where were you? What did you do? And to me, the answer is, I was there. I was there, and I was engaged, and I had the opportunity to meet and to work with and to move our community better by, just being arm in arm, shoulder to shoulder with so many amazing people. The people that are on this panel, the people that I see that are tuned in today. I mean, our community is full of so many great people, and so get there and bring somebody with you, right? Challenge, put that out and bring somebody with you, and stop labeling people. Denise, your question is talking about, young people who've already been labeled this way. And so whether it's young people, whether it's people that look differently than us, that worship differently, that think differently, or that are engaged in a different profession. I mean, to our police officers, and I've heard this time and again today, and I want to thank you guys for not judging the Hamilton Police Department or our officers as individuals based on the actions of people that we don't know, and we have no connection to those people, and so not allowing that, our officers, like your son, talking about having those conversations, and anybody else here, every person wants to be judged by their own individual actions, their own character. And Bernice, I'm going to have to excuse myself, but I've talked a lot about character today. We talk about that in our hiring process. We talk a lot about that with our officers, and I know I've heard it today. And so a lot of times people define character as, what do you do when nobody's watching? And to the point of where were you and what did you do? For me, character is not what you do when nobody's watching. That's important. But to me, character is, what did you do when everyone was watching? What did you do when everyone was watching and what you knew in your heart was right wasn't popular? What did you do in that situation? And to me, that's where I think it's incumbent on all of us to stand up, to speak out, and to work to move our community forward. Thank you. This has been great. I look forward to the follow-up.
So I want to tell you thank you before you leave for being a participant. And I will follow up with you because I think that there's lots more work that we can do as being community leaders. So thank you again. I appreciate it. So sorry. So in continuing the conversation, I'd like to take a step back a little bit. We've learned a lot about the work that we do. We've learned a lot about each other. We've learned a lot about some of the things that are happening. And one of the notions out there is for us to take a look at those grassroots efforts. But one of those grassroots efforts is activism. It's been around for as long as we can think about. So my question to you is that how can we get back to some of those grassroots efforts like activism, and what can we learn from that?
Dr. Beneath, about the last question, it kind of goes together about getting what can we learn from grassroots. We can't despise small beginnings. Just to necessarily touch on that one, I remember learning that the term "right on red" and it was actually introduced by high school students in a youth and government program at the YMCA. So they actually came up with this legislative in a program. There was just a small amount of students. They presented it, just to see what the state house would say, and getting passed a long time ago. You can't never small beginnings, and with activism, you never know what kind of change you're going to have on somebody too, even at the small level, and what they're going to end up doing down the line. And I like to think of that a lot of times we're activists for our youth at the community center because they don't always often in rooms to speak to people that are making the decisions and influence a lot of things that's going on in their lives. And that kind of goes to your last question. How do we, we can be the voice for those people. We have to not just be in the room when we do have a chance to be at the table, but we actually have to be a voice that can be loud and tell the stories of the student that may be on surface. Like the iceberg effect, you just see the tip of the iceberg. You just see the unruly child, or you see somebody that's troubled. But what are the causes and the factors that add to what you see on top of the water? What's underneath the surface that's really affecting that person? So even in activism, we have to constantly be vocal when we have opportunities to be at the table to talk about issues that's not only affecting a child but a community. What you see on the iceberg on the top of it is the anger. And you see some of the even racism things that we're dealing with in the community today. But what are the roots to those things? And getting into those conversations and have that conversation and continue the conversation with a commitment and being patient, because it's process. We didn't get here overnight, but we have to continue to have an ongoing conversation, make progress.
I'll jump in there real quick. Go ahead.
Oh, no, you go ahead, Wendy. Oh, okay. Well, I'm an academic. I, end up talking through and thinking through a lot of these issues in classes because we're trying to create spaces where we can unpack, right? Like not only the information, but how students get to process that information in a safe space to kind of unpack things like we've been trying to do here, but also, oftentimes there is that moment where they're like, but so what do we do now? Like they did that, but what do we do? Or how are we different? How does that work now? And some people will, get to that stage of saying the thing that worked then isn't going to be the thing that works now. There are multiple ways, right, of of protesting. I've been in these conversations where it's like there are so many different ways of saying we're not doing that way anymore, or we require accountability, or we want some change, or et cetera. And helping students, family, friends to get to that place usually requires several different kinds of processes. And I really appreciate, Samy, your point about, not despising small things, because it's all the things. I had a conversation with my niece the other day who was, super disappointed she didn't get to go to a protest she had been planning to go to for a whole week. And I told her, sometimes your protest is making sure that you and your friends are registered to vote. Sometimes your protest is making sure that you graduate this high school and move on to that HBCU and come out of there successfully, as a Black female. Sometimes the protest is, responding in love to the microaggressions that come at you, the inappropriate things that happen to you. And do not confuse when I say responding in love to responding, benignly. You know what I mean? But it means that sometimes it's an intervention, right, in those other ways. So there are all of these ways, but I mean, I want to highlight several things if I have a second. One, I think that people need to deconstruct, like actively deconstruct the artifacts that surround us, the artifacts of our culture. And that is happening in multiple ways, but that's that part of self-education and reflection. If you take a pause and begin to analyze, to listen to the stories, to analyze what you see in that evidence, to ask questions about those things and reflect upon what they mean and where they come from. Like, that's an important move to make before you run into the street and sort of say, this is what we're going to do. Without thought, it's not useful. I've had conversations with professionals across the country who have said, I have these allies who are, ready to institute this, that, and the other. And the problem is they've done no self-reflection, right? They've done no self-education. And until they have that moment, and you suggest that moment, like, look, it's completely possible to be a very important ally in these conversations, but you cannot do it without reflection. You cannot do, for example, begin to institute conversations with students who you have no idea how your comments have been affecting them, right? Or how the things you've said have come off from a space of white privilege or even racist comments. But because you see now that something's wrong, you want to immediately sort of run at them and re-traumatize them in some ways. Secondly, I think that there is an important opportunity for us to think futuristically. This is my bias, right? Toward the possibilities and toward, the fact that I do certain kind of literature. Sort of like to stop thinking about the systems that exist and help our students and the young people around us and the older people around us to think about what could exist. Because the only reason we're not able to conceive of certain things being different is that we won't let our imaginations play those scenarios out. We don't stop and say, but what could it look like if we did this, 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 and this? And that's the kind of critical analysis and thinking and creativity that this is going to require. In the same way that we think about, not grabbing hold of certain phrases and letting them fall to the ground because they sound too radical for us, but saying, well, what would it look like if instead of calling police, we called on a cadre of social workers to address certain things? What would it look like if instead of calling the police, we called upon this group of well-trained mental health experts who could respond to this situation. Like, what could that look like? And what kind of funding do those programs need? And how might we in that way invest ourselves in new structures and new systems? Because some of these systems are so broken, they're in a million pieces. And we're busy trying to like puzzle them back together in a different order as if that's going to change it. But in reality, we may have to say that puzzle's broken. Okay, what can we think futuristically and redesign to make this thing come out with a different outcome and revert our insanity? And then, you know, one of the things is, you know, democratics, right? The democratizing things and being aware of, like was said before, voting and engaging in citizenship, in active citizenship, which is super important. And then, you know, finally, there's just, I just want to reiterate, there are a lot of ways to respond in this moment. And we have to acknowledge that there are many, many different ways to address these things and to allow people to be creative about the ways that they address it. We cannot just keep writing another statement. We cannot just keep sending out letters and stuff saying, this sucks or this is awful. No, we have to sort of say, how can we think about this differently? And I think that falls on us to do that.
We're running short on time, so I'll try to be fast here. I want to be careful by saying that there are lots of well-meaning organizations and missions that have caused some real trauma to folks. There was a time in our history when Native children were stripped out of their homes, taken to boarding schools under the mission and guise that if they could kill the Indian, they would save the man. And by that, they meant if they could assimilate them to dominant culture, that they would do fine and life would be good and they would just become a part of the fabric of Turtle Island. That did not work out so well. So I want us to be mindful of well-intentioned folks who may not be listening to what the needs are and reminding ourselves that our first job is to listen and to respect the needs of the community, not to assume that we know what needs to happen. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that it's not going to take just one organization. It's going to be an interwoven fabric of partners, just like we're seeing here, and probably those who are listening as participants, to come together to address the complexity of these issues. It's not going to happen overnight. I think we need to be patient with one another. I think that the most important thing for me today to say before we leave is that the underscoring of the relationship piece of this is really what I see might be different from the past. The diversity of those who are marching into the streets and pouring out looks very different from the marches of the past. It gives me hope, but it also gives me pause, because I don't want to have happen what happened to young Native children, which is, we got this figured out for you, so you just need to listen to us. We need to listen to each other and figure out a strategic plan to dismantle racism in a systematic way that respects the needs of the community. I would end by saying that there might be an opportunity for those of you who are on this web town hall to consider getting involved locally. We're thinking about building a coalition against hate for Butler County. We want to explore that. We're inviting folks who might be interested in that possibility with the YWCA and our other partner organizations to let us know in the chat. Give us your email and we'll follow up with you in the coming weeks. We have to first say, not here, we don't accept this in our community. So we respond to incidents of hate, and then we become proactive in saying, instead of that condition, this is where we're headed. So we invite those who are like mind and want to work hard to join us. Thank you.
And I might add, and who want to put in the work. So thank you all. I'm going to end with two things. One a few things. One by thanking you all for coming. The other is I have one more question and I would like for each of you to answer that, but I'm only asking for one thing. You know, this is a start. This is a start. What tends to happen oftentimes is that we start and we never take the next step. We never continue with the conversation. We never move things forward with some actionable, tangible, concrete next steps. So I would like for each of you all to give me one next step that you would like to see, and I'm going to jot those down. And then we will have closing remarks by the Dean of Miami University Regionals, Dr. Kathy Bishop-Clark. So one thing moving forward, and then we'll have closing remarks.
I'll just jump right in. I will say thank you so much, Wendy, for putting the carrot out there about the coalition against hate. I'm definitely interested, and I think that that is a very solid next step, is having a group of people organized to start digging deeper into the situation locally, regionally, and start, plotting out some next steps. Educating ourselves about it, thinking about it, but not leaving it at just the discussion, but moving forward with action.
I guess I'll follow up. One next step that I'm absolutely dedicated to, well, I got a few, but I would definitely want to join Wendy. I don't want to say that first for as preliminary, but also I believe that we have to address the equity gap in our society, and something that I don't know exactly how it looks, but I definitely know it's something that's needed. And as a personal testimony to me, is that my lifestyle changed as I got educated and graduated college. Doors were changed. My perspective on the worldview was changed. So many things changed through my experience at college. And I really believe that I'm radical, and I might be far out there, that we should have some kind of policy for young African Americans to be able to get incentivized to graduate college and not have debt after they finish college, and start changing the narrative of that being a new normal in the Black community. And statistics recently, it was almost 20% actually go on to college after high school and graduate. And we need to make that, that number needs, I think, a way to address that would be able to offer that. And that's something that I'm going to be talking to local.
Okay, I think we lost the last end of what you said, Samy, who is a Miami Regionals graduate. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just said I plan on working with our local, state, and federal representatives about getting universal educational incentives for young African Americans to be able to graduate and be given debt free. I believe that addresses the equity gap, and that was what I said basically in a nutshell.
I really think this is a difficult one, because I think that there are so many lanes, right? I think that a person has to determine their lane, their sphere of influence, as I think that we've been talking about, right? But all of these things I would agree with. Conversations are important. Activity in terms of education, that's important. Listening is important. I think that determining what next steps are has to do with where you're standing, and what has or hasn't happened yet, right? Because we don't want to cherry pick our next step. If there's not actually been a moment of listening, you don't jump to, let's create a program, right? But if you are already engaged, in the community, like the Ys, et cetera, there's been years of this kind of thing. So folks have to kind of understand that where you stand, like you have to examine where you stand and determine what's most necessary. Have I done the self-reflection yet? Because that's kind of step one, to educate myself and to think about that before I start having all of these programmatic, options out there. So I'll speak from my lane. And so I think in my lane, in terms of education, I think that there needs to be a courageous move to say that what we value is invested into what we require from students. So from my lane as an academic, I would like to see that the kinds of courses that students consistently say change their perspective on the world and on other people, because it gets them out of themselves and begins, to help them see and unpack difficult things and sensitive issues, that those become, primary for the process. It doesn't mean we're all going to end at the same, sort of idea or the same exact result or of what we think is important, but that ought to be required, really focused as a requirement. There needs to be an anti-racist requirement, so that we don't get back here, to the same conversation of, because hate, some people who exhibit racist tendencies and implicit biases don't see themselves as exhibiting hatred, right? Like there's an unpacking of some of those things. So I would say to sort of examine where we are and to require those kinds of conversations and show us how to have them, right? How to have that conversation.
Did you want to answer that, Wendy?
I think I jumped in my last answer, so I'll pass. Thank you.
All right. So in the interest of time, I want to say thank you to all of our panelists and thank you to our listening audience. And we will now have our closing remarks from the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Science, or Miami University Regionals, Dr. Catherine Bishop-Clark.
Thank you, Benice. And everybody, sorry I was not there at the beginning. I was frantically trying every device I had. I did hear every word you said. I was there as a participant, but as a participant, I can't be heard. So first of all, let me just say thank you to all of our panelists. I have to note that several of you are Miami Regionals graduates, and that's an awesome thing. You really inspired me and you have me thinking in different ways, and I appreciate your candid vision, your candid conversation. And the reason I slipped vision into that is because one of the things I did want to share is that several years ago, we created a new vision at Miami University regional campuses. And that vision has just 4 words. It was deliberately 4 words, so we can hopefully remember 4 words. And it is empowering minds, strengthening communities. 4 words. Okay, but all that is so relevant to what we talked about today. Empowering minds and strengthening our communities. I wanted to end also kind of answering the question that Benice just posed to us. And I also thought a lot about, okay, so where do we go from here? What do I do about this? And I think all of us you are invited because you're a leader in this community. And so as a leader, we all have responsibilities. I have a responsibility to support activities like this. I have a responsibility to help create and support curriculum that can change views. As the leader of campuses, I have that responsibility. But I also wanted to share a responsibility that I feel like I also have. So I went on a bike ride recently, and on this bike ride, I had a animated, enthusiastic conversation with a friend of mine, and it was about racism and white privilege and sexism. And my miles per hour went up about 2 to 3 miles per hour during that animated discussion. So we were moving faster, and we were both very, very passionate about what we were saying. And the conversation lasted maybe 30 minutes with both of us ending in such frustration that we couldn't communicate. We just couldn't communicate. So we're longtime friends, and this bike ride lasted a couple days. So we both, did our own things. We were able to switch back to friendship mode. The next day we got back on the bike. Both of us had been processing it all night long. And we again had the conversation, but this time we both were trying very hard to listen, which is very hard when you have your own passionate views, right? I was trying very hard to listen. My friend was trying very hard to listen. And I think we left at least understanding a little bit more of what the other person thinks. And I think that's the kind of things that can help us move forward. And I point that out just to share that it's not just the big things we do. It's not just the big things as the dean of the regional campuses. It's also the little day-to-day activities that we have and the conversations that are available to us. And then my very, very last comment is to end on a crazy positive note, because, we're dealing with a lot, more than I've ever seen. We're dealing with a lot, but Boyce just had a baby boy, and he is 6 days old. So in the midst of chaos and hatred and pain and suffering and exhaustion, I just want to highlight that beautiful things are still happening. So congratulations, Boyce. And again, thank you all. It was very inspiring.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you so much.
So thank you all again, panelists, and thank you, audience. Please stay tuned or tune in, because we will be doing this again tomorrow with a different audience, with different panelists and different discussions. So please tune in again. We'll have more next steps. And thank you all for community conversations. Take care.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hamilton.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.